3:30 p.m. local time over the South China Sea, a U.S. Navy helicopter carried out maneuvers that immediately rattled Beijing. In response, China launched its top attack helicopter to intercept it. What the Chinese pilot didn't realize was that he was about to commit the kind of blunder that could end a career. For the next 72 minutes, his attempts to intimidate the world's most dominant navy would backfire spectacularly. Without knowing it, this pilot was about to reveal something Washington had long wanted to uncover, but Beijing hoped would remain hidden. Scrambled out of Xiamen just 28 minutes earlier, the Z-10 pilot's mission was simple: harass the Americans. The target was a U.S. Navy MH-60 Romeo, a helicopter so versatile it's often compared to a Swiss Army knife in the military aviation world. At that moment, the Romeo was shadowing a Chinese Type 039 diesel-electric submarine. The submarine had already been submerged for 2 full days and desperately needed to surface to recharge its batteries. Diesel subs are like people holding their breath. Eventually, they have no choice but to come up. And when they do, U.S. forces are waiting. Foreign military aircraft, you're approaching Chinese territorial waters. Alter course immediately, crackled a radio warning as the Z-10 swooped aggressively in front of the Romeo at 500 meters. The problem? They were still 50 nautical miles away from Chinese territory, flying through international airspace where the U.S. had every right to operate. The Romeo's crew of 3, a pair of pilots and a sensor operator, barely reacted. They already knew something Beijing didn't. Over the next hour, China's harassment campaign would turn into a colossal mistake. The Romeo wasn't on a sightseeing trip. Those bulges across its fuselage housed ALQ-210 electronic support pods, devices that function like vacuum cleaners for electromagnetic emissions. Every radar ping, comms channel, and engine signature from the Z-10 was being collected and stored. While the Chinese aviator believed he was posturing, the Z-10 itself revealed its weaknesses. It looks menacing with its sharp angles, but it's essentially a discount knockoff. What happens when you order an Apache from a bargain bin catalog? Its design roots trace back to the 1990s, when Russia sold China outdated blueprints just to raise cash. Intimidating? About as much as a Toyota Camry with a spoiler kit. The Chinese pilot fired 2 flares past the Romeo, nothing more than theatrics, the aviation equivalent of a yapping chihuahua taunting a pit bull. The U.S. response was cutting. They deployed their dipping sonar straight toward the submarine below. The signal was unmistakable. "We still see your asset." Realizing it had been compromised, the submarine crash-dived in panic. The noise it generated, cavitation bubbles, hull groans, pressure pops, was so loud that sensors across the American carrier group picked it up. In undersea warfare, noise is death, and the Chinese pilot had just doomed the very submarine he was supposed to shield. But things were about to get worse, much worse. At 2:48 p.m., after nearly 20 minutes of fruitless maneuvers, the Z-10 finally believed it scored a victory. Its targeting radar locked onto the Romeo, and the pilot heard the familiar engagement tone. For 3 fleeting seconds, he felt confident. That confidence evaporated the moment the Americans decided to respond. A nearby EA-18 Growler activated its ALQ-99 jamming pods and unleashed a torrent of electronic interference. To the Z-10's radar, the screen turned into static. The Romeo didn't just vanish, it multiplied. 12 ghost targets appeared, some drifting backward, others blinking across the sky as though teleporting. What the Chinese pilot had considered a show of strength instantly collapsed into an electronic nightmare. Display. That's what happens when outdated Russian surplus tech from the 1990s collides with cutting-edge U.S. electronic warfare. The ALQ-99 system doesn't merely block radar, it makes them hallucinate. It shifts frequencies at lightning speed, leaping across the spectrum quicker than the Z-10's sensors could keep up. By the time the Chinese pilot scanned one channel, the jamming had already scattered across dozens more, and the nightmare was only beginning. The next signal on his threat monitor sent a chill through him. The entire American carrier strike group had just locked onto his aircraft with their surveillance radars. It was like suddenly feeling the gaze of the Eye of Sauron fixed directly on you. From the deck below, FA-18 Super Hornets were already rolling into the sky, not to shoot him down, but simply to underline a point. This Romeo wasn't operating solo. Behind it stood the full weight of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Desperate, the Z-10 pilot cycled through every trick he knew, switching channels, cranking output power, even rebooting his radar mid-flight. Nothing worked. The Romeo's electronic suite blanketed multiple bands at once, delivering what American specialists call full-spectrum dominance, and what Chinese pilots usually mutter as, "We're screwed." Meanwhile, the American crew remained utterly relaxed, so much so they could have been talking about where to eat after the mission. They knew within minutes the humiliation for China would deepen. The Romeo's pilot banked slightly, once again lowering the dipping sonar toward the submarine below. Despite the aerial chaos, the sub was still being tracked, now thrashing into panicked, evasive turns. Each maneuver only made more noise, handing the U.S. sonar team an even clearer acoustic picture. Finally, the U.S. aircraft commander broke radio silence, his tone calm and absolute. Chinese military aircraft. This is a United States Navy aircraft conducting lawful operations in international airspace. We will maintain course and altitude translation. Nice try, rookie. Every passing second was a treasure trove for American intelligence collectors. They were recording staggering amounts of data, comms traffic showing encryption protocols dating back to 2003, radar signatures proving the systems hadn't advanced since Russia's 1990s design sell-off. Even the rotor blade harmonics unique enough to identify a Z-10 from 50 miles away by sound alone. But the humiliation wasn't over. The Chinese pilot's next move ensured it got worse. He had just entered what Americans dryly call the find-out stage. Infuriated by his failed electronics, he decided to close the distance to 500 meters, hoping being near would offset the jamming. From that range, he could clearly see the American door gunner manning the GAU 21.50 caliber, still aimed low, but sending a very clear message. Here the mismatch became obvious. The Z-10 lunged into violent maneuvers, rolling side to side, jerking upward, diving sharply, like a boxer throwing feints to provoke a mistake. But every whip turn bled away airspeed and pushed the Chinese airframe to its maximum G limits. The Romeo, built on the combat-proven Black Hawk chassis, easily held higher G loads while staying steady. The result? The Z-10 pilot wore himself out while the Americans barely adjusted. And through it all, the sensor duel remained entirely one-sided. The Romeo's AAR-47 missile warning suite was quietly cataloging everything. Turn rate capped at 20 degrees per second, climb rate maxing at 12 meters per second. Data that would later feed directly into U.S. missile programming, ensuring future intercepts against Z-10s would be brutally efficient. The Z-10 was practically writing its own destruction manual. The Romeo's FLIR camera captured the entire engagement in crisp 1080p infrared, cataloging every hotspot in detail, exhaust nozzles glowing at 450 degrees Celsius, transmission casings heating to 180 degrees Celsius. These thermal fingerprints would later guide American missile engineers on exactly where to direct heat seekers for maximum kill probability. In essence, the Chinese pilot was unknowingly filming a step-by-step tutorial on how to eliminate his own aircraft. And if he thought his weapons could shift the balance, he was sorely mistaken. The Z-10's 23mm cannon, designed for ground strikes, is accurate to about 2,500 meters on static targets. Against a moving helicopter, it's lucky to land rounds inside 500 meters. The Romeo's GAU-21, by contrast, reaches nearly 2,000 meters with armor-piercing incendiaries, rounds that would rip through the Z-10's cabin like wet paper. Given Chinese construction standards, that comparison isn't far off. By now, the Z-10's cockpit warning lights were blazing like a Christmas display. Control responsiveness was deteriorating, the airframe straining under stress, and the stick itself began pushing back against the pilot's inputs. Retreat meant court-martial, so he silenced the alarms and forced the helicopter harder for one last desperate push. 14 times he tried to achieve a radar lock. Each failed attempt was priceless to U.S. electronic warfare specialists. Every frequency hop, every pulse sequence, every futile burn-through effort was recorded. It was like watching someone endlessly enter the wrong password while the Americans wrote down each attempt. When the pilot resorted to laser designation through his electro-optical system, the Romeo's sensors not only detected it, they identified the exact model and firmware version. That single moment gave the U.S. the ability to counter not just one Z-10, but every Chinese platform using the same system. One helicopter had just compromised an entire weapons family. Stress began leaving visible marks. Engines screamed at 105% of continuous limits, throwing off an infrared bloom 40% brighter than normal. The Romeo's FLIR captured it frame by frame. U.S. missiles of the future would be programmed to recognize that specific flare of heat, meaning every Z-10 running at max thrust would paint a perfect target on itself. The signal's intelligence haul was even worse. Every exchange between the cockpit and ground command was scooped up. Their frequency hopping scheme turned out to be painfully predictable, letting U.S. analysts map out and pre-jam Chinese comms across the region. Performance continued to unravel as the duel wore on. Hydraulic pressure fell from heat buildup, the transmission crept deep into the red, servos began to lag, and controls went spongy under the load. The Z-10 wasn't just losing, it was actively dismantling itself in midair. At 3:42 p.m., the Romeo lowered its dipping sonar again, splashing into the sea. The submarine beneath remained firmly in the U.S. crosshairs. After 72 minutes of aggressive posturing, the Chinese pilot hadn't moved the Americans a single inch. His thumb hovered over the radio trigger to report back. But why bother? Command was already watching the same radar screens, seeing his failure in real time. The U.S. crew, on the other hand, had gathered over an hour of pure intelligence gold. They now knew which frequencies to jam, which thermal signatures to target, and which maneuvers the Z-10 simply could not sustain. The verdict was unmistakable. China's helicopter was more liability than weapon. The unspoken message rang clear: stick to copying smartphones. The skies belong elsewhere.